I thought I was safe in that relationship. When the betrayal came, it didn't just break the marriage, it broke the woman I had become inside it. What he never expected was that losing him would give me back myself. The pain turned into clarity. The ending became a beginning. The betrayal that almost destroyed me ended up being the greatest blessing of my life. Who I was before him. Before him, I was a whole woman. Not perfect, but whole. I had simple dreams, a life that made sense to me, and a quiet kind of peace I didn't know how rare it was. I laughed easily, I slept well. I made decisions without needing emotional permission from anyone else. But I also carried a silent wound, the kind many women never say out loud. The fear of ending up alone. I wasn't desperate. I wasn't searching frantically. But there was an open space inside me, a belief that love would arrive and complete something I hadn't fully learned to sustain on my own. That's where he entered. He came across as stable, calm, reliable, no drama, no intensity, no red flags, and maybe that's why I trusted him so quickly. He didn't promise the world, he promised presence, and to me that felt like maturity. I remember thinking, with him, I can finally rest. What I didn't realize was that I was slowly resting away from myself. Little by little, I began adjusting. Nothing drastic, nothing obvious. I spoke a little less. I compromised a little more. I softened opinions to avoid conversations he labeled as unnecessary, and I believed him. I believed that was what love looked like, that grown relationships required swallowing certain needs, that maturity meant silence. No one warned me that when you swallow too much, you begin to disappear. I was still me, just not entirely. I still smiled, just not freely. I was still strong, but I confused strength with endurance. If anyone had asked me back then if I was happy, I would have said yes, because I wasn't unhappy. But now I know the truth. I was absent from myself, and that absence became the perfect ground for everything that followed. Because when you step away from yourself, someone else will gladly take that place, even if they were never meant to care for it. I didn't know it yet, but the woman I was before him would have to be lost completely, so she could be found again, stronger than ever. In the beginning, everything felt easy. There were no dramatic highs or lows, no chaos, no jealousy, no emotional games, just routine, consistency, predictability, and to me that felt like safety. He called at the same time every day, came home tired, always with the same explanations, and I mistook repetition for honesty. The predictability calmed me. I remember telling my friends how different my relationship was. No drama, I said, no insecurity. He's stable, and he was, at least on the surface. He didn't hide his phone, didn't change passwords, didn't suddenly disappear for hours with absurd excuses. He simply became distant, and that's what makes it so confusing, because we're taught to look for obvious signs. But emotional absence doesn't scream, it whispers. He listened less, answered with shorter sentences, ended important conversations with, "We'll talk later," and I filled in the silence. I told myself it was stress, work pressure, a normal phase couples go through. I was excellent at explaining away behavior that hurt me. When I tried to talk about things that bothered me, he sighed before responding, as if my feelings were an inconvenience at the end of a long day. "You overthink everything," he'd say. "It's fine," and I believed him. Because admitting something was wrong would mean facing the possibility of losing him, and I wasn't ready for that. So I adjusted, lowered expectations, muted my needs, learned how to be easy to love. Not because I was light, but because I didn't demand much, and that, I later learned, isn't safety. It's self-erasure. The love that felt safe was comfortable for him, and quietly exhausting for me. Still, I stayed. I talked about future plans he answered with neutral smiles. Dreams he replied to with, "maybe." A "we" that only existed because I kept feeding it. Leaving would have meant admitting I was alone inside a relationship. Staying felt less painful, at least for the moment. I didn't know yet that this artificial calm was simply the silence before everything collapsed. The signs didn't arrive as warnings. They came as details, too small to justify a big reaction. And that's exactly why I ignored them. He started dressing a little better for nights out with friends. Nothing obvious, just more attention than before. A new shirt, a different cologne, an extra glance in the mirror. I noticed and smiled, because women in love learn early not to look suspicious. His phone buzzed more often. He glanced at the screen, then placed it face down, not hiding, just withholding. When I asked who it was, he answered without looking at me. Work stuff, and I accepted it. I always accepted it. Our conversations grew shorter. Our laughter became rare. Touch turned automatic, present but empty. It was like living with someone who was physically there, but emotionally always somewhere else. One night still stands out clearly. I was telling him about something that mattered to me, something personal, something real. He nodded, but his eyes were distant, phone in his hand, attention divided. Mid-sentence, he interrupted me. Sorry, can you repeat that? That's when I felt it. Not anger, not jealousy, loneliness. A quiet, heavy kind of loneliness. But instead of listening to that feeling, I swallowed it. I told myself, don't overreact. Don't create problems. Mature relationships don't need constant validation. I confused maturity with emotional absence. He stopped asking about my day, stopped being curious about my thoughts, stopped noticing my silences. And the most painful part? I started editing myself to fit his lack of interest. I talked less about me so I wouldn't sound needy. I laughed things off so I wouldn't seem dramatic. I dimmed my light so I wouldn't be too much. Deep down, I knew. Every woman knows. But knowing and being ready to admit it are two very different things. I wasn't ready, so I kept ignoring the signs. Not because I was naive, but because I was afraid. Afraid of confirming that the love that felt safe was already slipping through my fingers. While I was closing my eyes, the truth was getting closer. Quiet, patient, inevitable. The truth didn't arrive with a dramatic explosion. It came as something out of place. It was an ordinary afternoon. One of those days that seemed too small to change a life. He left in a hurry and forgot his phone on the table. I had never gone through his things. I never needed to. But that day, something inside me went quiet. Not curiosity, intuition. The phone vibrated. An unfamiliar name. A short message. Too intimate to be professional. Too familiar to be innocent. My body reacted before my mind could. I wasn't searching. I wasn't invading. The truth simply presented itself. I opened the conversation, and there it was. Everything I had been avoiding. The jokes I no longer heard. The attention that was no longer mine. The tenderness that had been redirected to another woman. There were no dramatic love confessions, no elaborate plans, just routine. And that hurt more than anything. Because it wasn't a moment of weakness, it was a repeated choice. I sat on the couch with his phone in my hands, waiting for the ground to disappear. It didn't. What broke was deeper. The image I had of him. The woman I thought I was inside that relationship. The us that only existed because I carried it. When he came home, I already knew. He saw it in my eyes. He started explaining before I asked anything, spoke fast, justified too much. He said it meant nothing, that he was confused, that he never wanted to hurt me. Maybe he was confused, but in that moment I was clear. I didn't scream. I didn't cry in front of him. I didn't make a scene. I listened. And while he talked, I understood something painfully obvious. He was more concerned with easing his guilt than acknowledging my pain. That's when I realized the betrayal didn't start in that conversation. It started long before, when he stopped choosing me every day and I kept choosing both of us. If this story is speaking to you, subscribe to Stories We Tell, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear this today. Your support helps us keep telling stories about strength, emotional justice, and new beginnings. That night, I barely slept. But for the first time in a long while, I slept with the truth. And the truth, as painful as it is, has a strange way of setting you free. I didn't know how yet, but I knew nothing would ever be the same again. After the truth settles in, there's no anesthesia. The days that followed felt heavy in a way I had never experienced before. Not dramatic, not chaotic, just heavy. I woke up every morning with a strange pressure in my chest, as if my body knew something my mind was still trying to process. I went to work, I answered messages, I smiled when people spoke to me. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. I cried quietly, usually in the shower. Not because I wanted to hide from others, but because I didn't want to explain. Explaining hurts more than crying. People ask too many questions when you say you've been betrayed. They want details, they want reasons, they want to know what you did wrong. As if pain needs justification, so I carried it alone. The hardest part wasn't accepting that he cheated, it was realizing how long I had been disappearing before that. I replayed memories, searching for the exact moment I stopped being a priority, not to him, but to myself. And every memory came with a cruel kind of guilt. If I had spoken up sooner, if I had demanded more, if I had been different. Betrayal has a poison to it. It convinces women that the failure belongs to them. There were days I felt invisible, other days replaceable. And then there was the fear, the one I never said out loud, the fear that maybe I wasn't enough to be chosen again. Because betrayal doesn't just break trust, it fractures your relationship with yourself. I questioned my judgment, my instincts, my worth. I questioned how I could have loved someone so completely and still been left behind. But something unexpected happened in the middle of that pain. Between one silent breakdown and another, I noticed something missing from the house. Not him, the tension. I didn't have to monitor my tone anymore. Didn't have to wait for replies. Didn't have to compete with distractions. The pain was raw, undeniable, but there was also space. Space to breathe, space to think, space that belonged only to me. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't shrinking to fit into someone else's life. And in that fragile space, a question began to form. Who could I become if I stopped trying to be chosen? I didn't have an answer yet. But for the first time since the betrayal, I felt something that wasn't pain. I felt possibility. The rebuilding didn't begin with big decisions. It began with small, almost invisible choices. I started waking up earlier, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I walked without headphones, letting my thoughts catch up with me. I traded sad music for silence. Silence taught me how to listen again. I stopped explaining myself, stopped justifying my feelings, stopped waiting for approval that never came anyway. Little by little, I reclaimed the space I had abandoned inside myself. One morning, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual, not searching for flaws, but looking for recognition. And there she was, not broken, not defeated, different. There was something steadier in my eyes, something that no longer asked permission to exist. I didn't announce my change. I didn't post quotes about healing. I didn't make speeches about growth. I simply lived. And that, I learned, unsettles people more than confrontation ever could. He noticed. Not immediately, but eventually. His messages changed. They became cautious, curious, concerned. You seem different. Are you okay? I've been thinking about you. I read them calmly, without rush, without urgency, because when you finally feel whole again, you don't panic when someone from the past knocks. I wasn't rebuilding out of spite. I wasn't chasing revenge. I was returning to myself. I started laughing again, genuinely. Not the polite laughter I used to offer to keep the peace, but the kind that comes from feeling light. I went out with friends I had slowly drifted away from. I occupied spaces I once avoided to avoid problems. I chose myself in ways that felt unfamiliar at first, then natural. Something else changed too. My pain began turning into clarity. I could see the relationship for what it was, not as a tragedy, but as a lesson. I realized I could tell my story without portraying myself as a victim. I could remember without bleeding. That's when I knew. The woman who was coming back didn't need to prove anything. She only needed to keep going. He came back when he realized he no longer had access, not because he suddenly understood my worth, but because he felt the loss of control. The messages became more frequent, the tone softer, almost careful. You seem distant. You've changed. I miss talking to you. I read them without urgency. There was no rush anymore, because I wasn't waiting. When we finally met, I could see the discomfort in him. He spoke too much, explained too fast. He tried to rebuild a version of the past that made him look less guilty. He said he was confused, that he never meant to hurt me, that I had always mattered. I listened politely, and for the first time, I saw him clearly, not as the man I loved, but as someone afraid of no longer being necessary. He wasn't fighting for us. He was fighting his own irrelevance. He wanted understanding, closure, forgiveness that would ease his conscience, but I wasn't there to offer any of that. Not because I was angry, but because I was finished. There was a moment of silence between us, a long one, the kind that demands honesty. I smiled, calm, sincere, and said something he never expected. Thank you. He looked confused. I didn't explain, because that gratitude wasn't for him. It was for what I had gained by losing him. The greatest defeat for someone who betrays is not losing the relationship. It's realizing the other person no longer needs them to feel whole, and that's exactly what he saw in me. It took time to say this without trembling, but today, I know it's true. The betrayal that broke me was the same one that saved me, not because it hurt less, but because it woke me up. If he hadn't betrayed me, I might still be there, shrinking myself to fit, calling silence maturity. Pain forced me to choose myself, to leave, to rebuild, to remember who I was before I started asking for permission to exist. I learned that love doesn't require silence, that safety doesn't ask you to disappear, that someone who truly loves you never makes you compete with absence. When I look back now, I don't feel anger. I feel clarity, because some losses are not punishments. They are releases, and some betrayals are not the end of the story. They are the beginning of a much bigger life. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to Stories We Tell, leave a like, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps us keep creating stories about love, forgiveness, and second chances, because stories that touch the heart deserve to be told and remembered. Thank you for being here.